If you were to look at the hospital system before, for example, you wouldn't necessarily need to carry out these life-saving amputations because you would have had a system that functioned. You would have had reconstructive surgery possible. You would have had immediate life-saving surgery possible, and they would have been able to save these limbs. And now we are doing everything we can just to save lives in the moment. And the hospital systems, the healthcare system is completely overwhelmed. We see gunshot wounds now in children from quadcopters, which are basically drones with guns. And we see, and we have been seeing, an alarming number of increasing infectious diseases, hepatitis A outbreaks, even Shigella outbreaks. We've seen destruction to the women's healthcare system, where women now have to give birth in one hospital versus the many hospitals that were available before. They have maybe an hour to recover after a vaginal delivery. And as soon as they can walk, they have to get out after a C-section. This allows us no time to work with them on breastfeeding, for example. This allows them no time for healing. We have women who had been seeking fertility treatments for many, many years, delivered by C-section because they're so terrified of going into spontaneous labor. And even they have to stay a few hours after the delivery. What we're seeing as well that we had not seen before in Gaza is acute malnutrition. Gaza has had, as a result of siege and many years of occupation, problems with iron deficiency anemia or micronutrient deficiencies, which for women is a problem because it puts them at risk for postpartum hemorrhage or intrapartum hemorrhage. But now, because of this war, in just 6 months, we've seen rates of malnutrition spiking. We've seen women who are forced to feed their children squeezed dates into a tissue so that they can get them some kind of sugary substance into their bodies. There are 2, if not 3, particularly vulnerable groups when it comes to malnutrition. One is women of this lactating age, pregnant and lactating women. And one is children who are under 2, which is the breastfeeding age. In a normal situation, you have to have healthcare providers need to be able to spend many, many days, if not weeks, with women to help them lactate. In a normal situation, it's difficult. Under this current situation, we cannot access our patients safely. The women do not have enough nourishment to themselves produce milk, which therefore puts the child, these babies, at risk for malnutrition. In order to breastfeed, you have to have nutrition yourself. If you do not have breast milk, you can use formula. But in order to use formula, you need to have clean water. And none of these things are possible in Gaza right now. And the third population, particularly at risk for malnutrition, are children with disabilities. They need special care, and they do not have access to those types of services. In addition, we see more and more problems with chronic diseases. What we're basically having to do is make a choice between saving the life of someone who's dying in front of us today, but at the risk of someone who will die tomorrow. These people cannot access the services for fear of being targeted in healthcare structures. The aid that is required is completely arbitrary. One truck may arrive today, another truck with the same contents may be denied tomorrow. What this means is that doctors have to choose between sedating a patient so that they can intubate them to save their lives and treating a seizure because it's the same medication that's required. The entire system has broken down. Marie-Aure has mentioned mental health ramifications. The consequences are acute. We see them in our staff who are exhausted. They have been working day in and day out for 6 months straight. We see them in their children. We see it in the regular population, and we're going to continue to see it for many, many years. The other thing that we need to be able to do that we cannot do is evacuate patients who cannot, under the current circumstances, receive care in Gaza. And they need to be able to do that without prejudicing their right of return. We need to be able to get patients out to safely get care for cancer, for dialysis, for the injuries that they're suffering. And there are currently a number of restrictions on getting those patients out. We have been doing this work for 50 years. We cannot do our jobs the right way in the current circumstances. This is unlike anything we've ever seen.
I'd like to make three additional points. The first one is around Rafah. A ground invasion of Rafah is planned. I cannot imagine any scenario where this would not be utterly catastrophic. Whilst I was in Rafah and staying in Rafah, the latest siege around Al-Shifa started. And people were instructed to move further south to Al-Mawasi, the Al-Mawasi area of Rafah where I was staying. The irony of this is twofold. Firstly, that people could not evacuate towards Al-Mawasi because of the IDF checkpoints en route. The second is that they are being sent to the very area that is under threat of catastrophic carnage. Where else would they go? There is nowhere left in the north. In the middle area, what little healthcare remains is collapsing under the pressure. A Rafah invasion would be another example of this war being conducted without rules and without costs. It simply must not happen. What the people of Gaza need is an immediate and sustained ceasefire. It took too long for the UN Security Council to pass a resolution for ceasefire. Now they must ensure that this was not an act of meaningless political theatre. Secondly, humanitarian workers are protected. No ifs, no buts. We do not accept the narrative of regrettable incidents. We do not accept it because what has happened to World Central Kitchen and MSF's convoys and shelters is part of the same pattern of deliberate attacks on humanitarians, health workers, journalists, UN personnel, schools, and homes. This is not just about implementing an effective deconfliction mechanism. Our movements and locations are shared, coordinated, and identified already. This is about impunity, a total disregard for the laws of war, and now it must become about accountability. I was personally promised an investigation into a convoy of ours that was attacked in November. I've had no response. I've since filed a dossier of further incidents. I am waiting for follow-up. We will not let this go. We expect more. We expect more than excuses from Israel, and we expect more than condemnation from Israel's allies. We expect more than condemnation from Israel's allies. The condemnation we see for the World Central Kitchen incident is right and just, but where is it for every other humanitarian worker, for every other hospital that is destroyed, for every attempt to manipulate the media? The final point I would like to make is that on the 26th of January, the International Court of Justice issued provisional measures with respect to the prevention of genocide in the Gaza Strip. I want to focus on two measures which in my opinion are the pillars of this ruling from a humanitarian perspective. The first being that the State of Israel should take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts, in particular, killing members of the group and causing seriously bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group. And secondly, that the State of Israel should take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. On the first, in our own facilities, we see the indiscriminate nature of the bombing, the men, women, and children with horrific wounds in Rafah Indonesian Field Hospital and Al-Aqsa Hospital in the middle area, the little boy whose leg was burned in the school where he was sheltering, the siege of Gaza, the siege within the siege of the north of Gaza, the overflowing morgue of Al-Aqsa, which at times has received more than 100 bodies a day, when an emergency room receives more dead patients than injured, a psychologist who lost 8 members of a family, the kids drawing pictures of bombs falling on their tents, the destruction of vital civilian infrastructure and cutting off essential services like water and electricity. This is a collective punishment which is prohibited under international law. The 32,000 people killed, the list goes on and on. All states who are supporting Israel in these circumstances are morally and politically complicit. We call on all states, in particular the United States, the United Kingdom and the EU, to do whatever in their power to influence Israel and to stop supporting the ongoing siege and the continuing attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructures in Gaza. On the second measure from the ICJ, the image of humanitarian aid is being used as an alibi to perpetuate the brutal and disproportionate way in which this war is being waged. Much of the narrative around humanitarian assistance has been around counting trucks crossing a border and airdrops. These are simply distractions meant to create an illusion of aid. Firstly, there are less trucks crossing the border now compared to before October the 7th. Before October the 7th, there were 500 trucks per day, of which 150 were food. Between October the 7th and the 24th of February, there have been an average of 90 trucks per day, of which 60 are food. Crossing points all around Gaza, the south, the middle, and the north must be opened. But it is important to acknowledge that humanitarian assistance is much more than just counting trucks. It is moving supplies around safely. It is security at the point of distribution. It is functioning hospitals, which are more than 4 walls and a roof. They are water, electricity, fuel, and communications. They are trained, qualified staff who have eaten and can work through their mental trauma. It is being able to remain in a health facility long enough to provide continuity of care for complex fractures and infected wounds. Any aid worker will tell you about the ineffectiveness of airdrops. The community leaders from Khan Yunis have been speaking of being killed by bombs one day and killed by falling aid from the sky the next. The narratives about counting trucks and images of airdrops are not indicators of success. They are an admission of failure. Humanitarian assistance relies on the safety of aid workers to bring in supplies, to distribute food, and to treat patients. We have tragically seen nearly 200 killed. Humanitarian assistance requires for people to be able to access essential services, and yet humanitarians can barely visit the twice besieged north of Gaza, while in the south of Gaza, we have already been forced to evacuate 6 health facilities, including Nazir, what was the largest hospital in the south of Gaza. What we are asking for is very simple and very clear. The widespread and indiscriminate attacks on civilians, medical staff, and health facilities must stop immediately. Israel must allow unhindered humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. And above all, there must be an immediate and sustained ceasefire. I want to conclude by paying tribute to the aid workers in Gaza and all around the world who, with a great deal of self-sacrifice, devote their lives to helping people in need. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists. We will now take questions from journalists both here in the room in Geneva and those online. What we will do is we will alternate questions between those in the room and those online, so one in the room, one online, etc. We will please ask you to raise your hands, both if you're in the room and online. If you're online, please keep your microphone muted until you are called on. We will call on you by name for you to ask your question. Please keep your question brief. Thank you very much. We will start with, and when you are called on, if you can please state very briefly your name and the name of your media outlet, that would also be very, very helpful. So we will start here in the room.
Any special measures, security measures are being taken in light of what happened? Thank you.
I would say from the start of this conflict, we've been assessing our presence in Gaza on a daily basis. That hasn't changed. What I would say in terms of what happened to World Central Kitchen and to humanitarian workers, and with respect to humanitarian workers that have been killed more generally, is, as I just said, that this is more than just technical deconfliction. What we need is a political choice to ensure that this war happens in a very different way to what has been happening up until now. So in short, to answer your question, we remain present in Gaza, but we are assessing the risks to our teams on a daily basis.
Okay, thank you. We'll now take a question online from Jeremy Lange.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I will ask my question in French, if that's okay. I'm looking at Miss Perreaut Revial, peut-être qu'il va pouvoir me répondre en français, mais si quelqu'un d'autre veut répondre, il n'y a aucun souci. Deux questions. Vous avez parlé, je crois, de nouvelles blessures. J'ai cru comprendre. J'aimerais que vous détailliez un petit peu ce dont vous parliez et depuis quand vous constatez ces nouvelles blessures sur les civils. L'autre question, mais vous y avez répondu en anglais déjà, mais peut-être une précision sur les effectifs de MSF sur place. Combien de personnes restent et combien de temps elles vont pouvoir y rester?
So I answer in French? Oui. Sur la première question et la question des blessures, c'est un constat de l'évolution du conflit entre ma première visite à Gaza au mois de novembre-décembre et cette seconde visite à Gaza entre février et mars. On voit la même proportion, encore une fois, de femmes et d'enfants qui sont affectés de façon complètement disproportionnée par cette guerre. C'était pas le cas avant. En tout cas, pour parler de l'hôpital d'Al-Aqsa, par exemple, dans la zone centrale de Gaza où j'étais basée personnellement, de voir des enfants qui se présentaient, des enfants et des adultes aussi, hein, mais qui se présentaient à l'hôpital avec des blessures par balle, qui apparaissaient être des blessures de tir de sniper. Dans plusieurs cas, c'est maintenant quelque chose qui a été documenté également dans les médias, des personnes qui étaient visées alors qu'ils tentaient de rejoindre ou de s'approcher du checkpoint qui mène vers le nord de Gaza, complètement désespérés de la situation dans le sud, qui n'offre pas de garantie de sécurité, qui n'offre aucune installation, qui n'offre pas d'accès à des services, y compris des soins de santé en quantité suffisante. Donc, c'est des gens qui sont laissés dans une telle situation de désespoir qu'ils en sont rendus à se dire on va tenter de retourner dans le nord parce que dans le sud, on n'a rien non plus et on n'est pas plus en sécurité. Pour la deuxième question et la question des effectifs, des effectifs à Gaza, pour l'instant, à la suite de l'incident avec la mort des 7 humanitaires de World Central Kitchen, pour l'instant, on n'a pas changé notre capacité, MSF n'a pas changé sa capacité opérationnelle dans Gaza. Mais comme Chris l'a dit, ça s'inscrit dans une tendance qu'on observe depuis le début du conflit, où les travailleurs humanitaires sont visés, où les travailleurs de santé sont visés. Et depuis le début, chaque jour, on réévalue notre présence dans Gaza. Et c'est quelque chose, en tant que coordinatrice d'urgence, que je n'ai pas expérimenté dans d'autres contextes, où encore une fois, on en est rendu à devoir planifier nos opérations en pensant est-ce que cet hôpital sera le prochain visé ou est-ce qu'on peut se dire qu'on va dans cet hôpital parce que peut-être qu'il sera un peu plus loin dans la liste. Est-ce qu'on peut rester aujourd'hui? Peut-être qu'on peut rester aujourd'hui, mais on a tous un sac à dos avec nous en disant peut-être qu'on va devoir évacuer demain. Parce qu'on ne sait pas combien de temps est-ce qu'on pourra rester aujourd'hui dans la bande de Gaza, dans le sud et dans la zone centrale de Gaza.
Thank you very much.
Laurent Siro, Swiss News Agency. First, what kind of ripple effects you expect from the loss of Al-Shifa in the rest of the health system, both in the north and maybe after some time in the south? And there will be tomorrow a draft resolution at the Human Rights Council on Gaza, where there is a call for a meeting of the high contracting parties to the 4th Geneva Convention. Does that make sense from MSF's perspective, or would that just be an additional meaningful meeting instead of implementing the ceasefire? Thank you.
I'll answer for Shifa and then leave the next one for Chris. So for Shifa, that was the largest hospital in Gaza, 700 beds. its destruction has been traumatic even for our staff who worked there, who trained there. As a doctor, I can say that you have an affinity for the hospitals where you work and where you've trained. And as it was a teaching hospital, many of our staff passed through there. Not only was it the largest hospital and a training hospital, it was a tertiary care center, which was capable of doing any number of providing any number of services. Its loss is an incredible loss for Gaza. After the initial bombardments and the initial destruction that we'd seen earlier or later last year in Shifa, the staff had begun to rebuild it. And one of our head of mission had visited it not like a month ago, and was seeing that people were rebuilding it, that they were starting the services again. We were trying to see how we could go back and work there because we had been present in Shifa for 15 years doing burns and trauma surgery. We were trying to figure out how to go back there. What does its destruction mean, other than what I've already described is, well, what's going to happen to the other hospitals? So we've seen the same destruction in Nasser. In 1 month, are we going to see that the army is going to come back and totally flatten Nasser and burn it to the ground with patients still inside? It's a concern for all of us because, like I said earlier, we've seen a destruction of the entire healthcare system. We rely on the health infrastructure in Gaza because it was robust and because we need it. And I'm sorry, but you could add 1,000 field hospitals and you're not going to be able to replace the hospital system, the healthcare system that was in Gaza before the war.
On the question of further meetings, I think I can't answer for the meeting in question, but I think in general, any tool that enables the visibility and the pressure to change the way that this conflict is going should be used. But at the end of the day, we need to move now from words into actions. We cannot allow this war to continue in the way that it has been doing, because there are now nearly 33,000 people who have been killed and 200 aid workers have lost their lives. So while I am not pro or against any particular meeting, what we now need is words to be turned into action.
Thank you very much. We'll take a question online now from Christoph Reuter, or Christoph from Reuters.
No, it's my family name, sorry. From Der Spiegel. It's one question about the detail of the second panelist. I thought it was Marie-Aure, Perreaut, Revial, when she talked about we see new trends, new wounds as children are shot by snipers. Then she mentioned a little girl that was covered in blanket brought to one of the medical facilities. And then she said, it is now so common that we have a standard operating procedure for this. But I missed the point. For what precisely you have a standard operating procedure? Because these details are helpful to explain the situation.
Sure. So last year in November and December, so I was based in the Al-Aqsa hospital, which is now the only hospital left in the middle area of Gaza. And we started seeing more and more children wounded coming with no surviving families. So they would come to the hospital on their own because the rest of their families had been killed very often in the bombing of their house. Back then, it was already very striking to see how healthcare workers were trying to deal with those patients, those orphans wounded. I remember another 7-year-old who was in the pediatric ICU department of the Al-Aqsa hospital, and she had also been severely injured from the bombing of her, as a result of her house being bombed, and the staff from the ICU was trying to hide from her that there was nobody else from her family left, that she was on her own. And back then, we were all sort of left completely powerless as to what to do with those patients, how to tell them, because I don't think anybody is trained, and I don't think anybody could ever be trained on how to announce such a thing to a child. Now it is such a common thing to have children coming to the hospital wounded with no surviving family that we have a procedure on how to deal with those patients, how to take care of them, how to refer them, trying to find some support network where no extended family. And in a place like Gaza, it means really that a lot of people from her family have died. If there is no extended family capable of coming to take care of that baby, it really means a lot of people have been killed. So it is now such a common thing that this is the kind of procedures that healthcare workers in Gaza have to come up with.
Thank you, Marie-Aure. A question from the room?
Yeah, I am Mohamed Iqbal from Turkey's Anadolu News Agency. Thank you for the brief for all of you. My question for the Chris. Chris, as you mentioned, including the World Central Kitchen workers, many humanitarian or health workers were killed in Gaza by Israeli attack. You also witnessed the situation on the ground. My question is, does Israel pay attention to the protection of civilians during its attacks, or is every civilian in Gaza now a potential target? Thank you.
I think what we can see in our hospitals is the indiscriminate nature of these attacks. When you look at the fact that Indonesian Rafah Field Hospital is full of men, women and children with horrendous wounds, when you look at the fact that Al-Aqsa Hospital is overflowing. And I would come back to the point that having this type of fighting warfare coming into the Rafah area, the prospect of this extending into Rafah is utterly terrifying, because there are people everywhere. There are tents and shelters lining the roads. There are kids running all around the roads. The number of kids that you see on the streets of Rafah is just astonishing. And so it is utterly terrifying, the prospect of transferring this type of action into the Rafah area of Gaza. I think that we have seen a disregard for civilians, and we have seen a flagrant disregard for humanitarian workers at the same time. 200 killed since October the 7th. This is utterly unacceptable.
Thank you. We're on to a question online. Fernanda Hernandez, please.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my question. My question is, what is the importance of a humanitarian organization like MSF working in Gaza? What could happen with the civilian population if a humanitarian operation ends or leave Gaza? Thank you.
I think the humanitarian effort in Gaza is an absolute lifeline for those who can access the humanitarian services in Gaza. And there is a large area of Gaza for which it is not possible to provide humanitarian assistance, particularly the north of Gaza, which is almost impossible to access. Our teams can go on fleeting visits very sporadically, very unpredictably. There is very little food. There are very little medical supplies in the north of Gaza. So while there is a lifeline being provided in some parts of Gaza, that lifeline is insufficient. Amber has described the inadequacy of the situation compared to the health system that was there before. I would say that the effort that is being made by all humanitarian organizations in Gaza, including the United Nations, is extraordinary. I've never personally seen the humanitarian community working together so well and so effectively. I think that there has been a great deal of leadership shown by several UN organizations, OCHA, the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the WHO, the Log Cluster, but I would also say that UNRWA the UN Works and Release Agency, is not just the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza, it's the backbone of society in Gaza. And any notion in terms of dismantling UNRWA is an absolute travesty in terms of what is required to support the people of Gaza. This is not something that can be cut up and replaced. This is an integral part of the society in Gaza and is essential for all of us to be able to do the work that we need to do in Gaza. So what is there is vital. It is far from enough. We need significantly more access all around Gaza, but particularly to the north. And the prospect of what a Rafah ground invasion would do for humanitarians to be able to continue to provide access in the south is terrifying. Let me give you a quick anecdote on that front. When I was in Rafah Indonesian Field Hospital a couple of weeks ago, I asked our team there and the director of the hospital, what are your plans in case of an invasion of Rafah? And they said, well, we would close the outpatient area, so people who are coming in for wounds that need dressing every 2-3 days but don't need to be hospitalized. We'll change that into an emergency reception area. In the meantime, we are working on an ambulance service to be able to evacuate patients from that hospital. And so then I asked the next logical question, where would you evacuate those patients to? To which there was no response. So to come back to your question, what is happening from a humanitarian perspective in Gaza is life-saving, it is essential, but is nowhere near adequate or sufficient.
Could I add
Yeah,
to that?
please.
If I might add as well, it's really important to understand that the presence of the humanitarian organizations in Gaza is one part of a larger whole. We've been working hand in hand with the healthcare community for many years. When Chris talks about UNRWA used to refer us, the patients from their primary care clinics who were in domestic burn accidents, for example. We work hand in hand with the local healthcare providers, with the fabric of the society, which UNRWA was part of. World Central Kitchen was providing meals to the patients in our hospitals. We used to work very closely, still try to work very closely with one of the largest mental health community centers in Gaza. Together we made up the healthcare infrastructure, and what we're seeing is that that's being broken down bit by bit.
Thank you, Chris and Amber. Question from the room?
Hi, it's Marie-Aure Jaffet from Geneva Solutions. 2 questions on the guarantees for humanitarian aid workers. Could you give a bit more detail on the evolution since the start? So, I mean, you receive certain guarantees, you give information on your movements and whereabouts. How's that changed, and how have those communication channels been broken down? And on your second point about UNRWA, I was wondering if you are you already seeing the impacts and the effects of the dismantlement of UNRWA? You mentioned that how you're all interconnected and working together. And could you talk a little bit more about how you're seeing the effects of the freezing of their funds, impacting their work and therefore impacting your work also?
So on the guarantees and the evolution since November, I think the evolution is just has just given us time to prove or to have the unfortunate experience that every single guarantee that we were able to obtain has failed. So all our locations where we have activities, so hospitals, primary healthcare centers, but also where we stay, so guest houses, shelters for our staff, offices, all the GPS coordinates are shared with all warring parties. Yet we've had hospitals being stricken, being targeted, evacuated when MSF teams were here, and the latest example is the strike on Al-Aqsa hospital. Inside the compound of the hospital, it's just a few meters outside of the emergency department where we have MSF team, where other teams of international organizations are working every day. Our movements are coordinated or notified. We request green lights prior to moving to a location, yet we had convoys attacked while going to the north. The shelters we've had two shelters that were hosting our staff and their families that were targeted, resulting in the death in family members of our staff being killed and some being injured. So the evolution was just having more unfortunate experience of none of those guarantees actually giving us any guarantee that we can work safely in Gaza now. And I think it's also important to mention that like what we're talking about now is our experience, is like what I'm talking about now is my own experience in the south of Gaza, but MSF has also suffered a great deal in the northern part of Gaza, and we've lost colleagues as well over there while they were working, while they were attempting to continue trying to provide care in hospitals, including Al-Auda Hospital in Jabalia, where we've lost colleagues in an attack on the hospital.
For the second part of the question, and actually just to come back on that one, I think the concept of deconfliction at this point has become almost a joke. Normally, you are in communication with the army when you're working in war zones. We don't have that direct line of communication. We go through a different party, the Kogat. We cannot say we're here and we've given you our coordinates, we've given you our location, we are here. We don't have that direct communication to be like, wait, we see you, we're here. We have to go through a third party to confirm, who then questions whether the photos are clear, if we can confirm this, etc. So the concept is completely out the window. In terms of the second question, the fabric of society and the ramifications for the defunding of UNRWA, actually, I'd like to come back a little bit and give a specific example when talking about malnutrition. UNRWA has been screening malnutrition and has been keeping tabs on that for decades. They run a huge network of primary care clinics throughout the Gaza Strip. In order to properly screen malnutrition, you have to have access to the population. You have to physically go in and weigh the children, take their height, their weight, their MUAC, the upper arm circumference. We cannot do that if we can't access the population. UNRWA has that kind of access to the population. They have teams throughout the communities. We don't have that kind of access because we can't safely move within the Gaza Strip. We can't even confirm what we're seeing in our own hospitals in terms of widening it to the larger population. So for example, I know that my staff are eating birdseed in the north of Gaza. We see children coming to our hospitals from the north, coming to our hospitals in the south from the north, who are acutely malnourished. But to be able to access this population, to be able to determine how we treat this population, we have to have direct contact with this population, not just to assess their needs, but to treat the disease. And also to emphasize, malnutrition is a disease. It is not something that can be aided with food dropping from the sky. We are beyond the point of food drops. If we were talking 6 months ago, yes, food might have been great. Food and water, sure, we still need that. But we're talking about malnutrition, which is a medical problem, which requires medical treatment. And to treat it, you have to have access to the population. And that is not possible in Gaza.
I want to just add a little bit to the coordination point. There's been at times throughout the course of this conflict, certain concepts have been overly simplified, and I think that's a distraction from the real problem. We've seen it around airdrops and counting trucks across borders as a symbol for humanitarian assistance. And I fear that over the last couple of days, that's what's happening with the conversation around coordination. There's been a coordination mechanism in place for months now We have been expressing our concern around that coordination mechanism for months now. It has failed multiple times over the last few months. The problem is what happens after you have coordinated your movement or your location, because that's a big black box. And clearly troops on the ground, tank commanders, aerial drones are not getting those messages. My fear is that a coordination, yes, there needs to be better coordination, but without the political will to prevent the killing of humanitarian workers, without the political will to change the way that this conflict is fought so that there is not indiscriminate bombing and this number does not tick over from 32,000 to 33,000 to 34,000, there needs to be a ceasefire that can allow people to move around Gaza, humanitarians to work around Gaza, and for people to be able to access to the north so that we can treat the malnutrition that Amber is talking about.
Thank you. We'll take a question online from Gabriel Joslo. I'm sorry if that's mispronounced.
All good. A question on accountability. Chris, you were mentioning that you were promised an investigation into the attack on the convoy in November. I was wondering who promised that investigation. Was it coming from the IDF, for instance? And then have you reported the other incidents where MSF staff and workers were targeted, including the attacks on shelters? And have you received any response at all, similar promises of an investigation or any explanation at all of why those facilities and those locations were struck?
So I reported it, and the promise was from our counterparts in Kogat, who is who we coordinate with. Yes, the other incidents have been reported with all the information that we have at our disposal, and no, I've received no explanation for any of the incidents.
Thank you. We'll take a question from the room.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin Millard from AFP. Just on deconfliction, it seems that the system is utterly broken. I just wondered, do you see any way now that this could possibly be fixed? Is there even enough trust remaining between the humanitarian community and Kogat, who you have to go through? Is there even enough trust still remaining now that there's any way that this could possibly be fixed?
I think I would go back to the point that this is part of the response to this is coordination and improving coordination, but what we need to see is a change to the way this conflict has been fought in a ceasefire. The thought of the level of brutality that we've seen in the middle area and the north coming to Rafah with this completely and utterly failing coordination system is terrifying. And coordination in any conflict is one thing, but it's the nature of the conflict that you're working in which is the real factor here. And unless that changes, I'm extremely fearful for what the consequences are going to be for the civilian population and for the humanitarian community.
If I could add as well, the other part of the problem is that the times that you request access to the north, for example, more times than not, the requests are denied. So for example, in our clinic in the north, we have a clinic in Gaza City that's been partially destroyed. We've got staff who are unbelievably resilient, who've been working there since the beginning of the war, almost voluntarily, trying to do what they can in terms of dressing care, primary care, who've been asking us if we can send supplies. We would love to send supplies. We can't get through. We cannot get through.
Thank you. We've got 3 more questions online. How many in the room? We'll take, Nick, if it's okay, we'll take 1 more online and then we'll come back to you. Elisa Miolen.
Hi, yes, this is Alyssa from DevX here. I just wanted to ask a question about, we had Save the Children had recommitted to staying in Gaza yesterday, and Christopher had mentioned that MSF was doing the same. There also has been reports, though, of kind of unnamed nonprofits, et cetera, pulling out, and I haven't yet heard that. I was just curious if you've heard of because of the World Central Kitchen attacks, other organizations leaving Gaza, or whether there's been, because of these issues, kind of a recommitment to staying. Kind of what's the landscape on the ground in terms of the humanitarian aid workers there and the organizations there too?
I don't think we heard any specific organizations, but to answer a bit on the landscape, we're all in the same situation of fearing having to, being targeted the next day and then having to leave. That's really in the amount of risk that we're taking being present in Gaza. And that our teams are going through every day. This is very, very, very high on the list, way too high on the list. So for now, I cannot say for other organizations, but the general landscape is a context like no other, where all humanitarian organizations are always ready to suspend operations because they can't run them anymore.
Maybe just to repeat what I said as well, from the start of this conflict, we have been assessing the risk to our teams on a daily basis. We're still present today, and we're going to continue to assess that risk. You've heard how important we think our presence and the presence of others is, but this is an extremely dangerous context in which hundreds of, now nearly 200 humanitarian workers have lost their lives. So there are no guarantees here.
Thank you. I'll take a question from Nick.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, Nick Cumming-Bruce for New York Times. Question may be a little bit premature, but following on from what colleagues have asked, has anything happened since the WCK attack that suggests to you the approach, the way this conflict is going to be waged has changed? Has there been any substantive outreach to any of the humanitarian actors that you're aware of about making this deconfliction system work? Or has there been any reduction in sort of the presence of drones or in airstrikes or in other aspects of the conflict? So that's one question. The second question was, we recently had an analysis of the IPC report from COGAT, which challenged it, said it was flawed technically, that it was inaccurate, and described deliveries of water that it said exceeded anything that was described in the IPC report. I wonder if you have a reaction to that, and if you could just maybe say a little bit more about, I appreciate you can't measure effectively malnutrition, but whether you are seeing fatal cases of starvation. Thank you.
We've seen no substantive change since the World Central Kitchen incident. I've heard the conversations around coordination. I would say that this is not new. I would repeat that we have been expressing our concerns around coordination for several months, and that what really needs to change is the way this conflict is being conducted, and that we have ultimately a ceasefire, which is needed immediately, and it needs to be sustained. I think I'm going to hand over to Amber in a second in terms of the nutrition point, but what I would say is, as Marie-Aure was saying, we are seeing rising cases of malnutrition, both in an inpatient and an outpatient perspective, that this has compounds the pressure on the hospitals. We are at the point in, as the example was given in Al-Aqsa Hospital, of having to choose between prioritizing beds for trauma patients and beds for nutrition patients, and we are having to, or staff are having to retrain from their prior experience to be able to treat nutrition, because it's something they don't have the experience on in the future. So we have very clear evidence of rising rates of malnutrition. Sorry.
I'll go back to the first question as well to say this isn't the first instance where humanitarian workers were killed. It's, as Chris has said, we've worked closely with World Central Kitchen and are really grieving over the loss, but this is not the first instance, and it's not the first instance that's been registered. And so I would ask the question, is there a difference when foreign nationals are killed versus Palestinians who are killed? Because to me, there shouldn't be. A humanitarian worker is a humanitarian worker. A doctor is a doctor and a nurse is a nurse. And it shouldn't matter what passport you carry, first of all. For the question on the IPC and on malnutrition, in order to, so the IPC rulings, there's many categories that go into classifying famine. The problem is that we, as a medical organization, we can handle one part. We're witnesses to coping mechanisms that are negative. People eating birdseed, for example, when they don't have access to food. The part that we have the most access to as a medical organization is rates of malnutrition. So that means measuring malnutrition. And we are seeing rates elevating by the day in the places where we're screening and treating in the South. But again, without access to the North, it becomes very difficult to actually measure. So what we're having to rely on are the other categories, which is negative coping mechanisms, et cetera. What I can say personally is we have staff who, for example, have children with disabilities, and they are really struggling to keep those kids alive. And they're in the North. I have a surgeon who, for example, a great surgeon actually, who just because he's worked in Europe has financial means maybe not provided to others, but told me that when he before he last left Gaza, he spent $1,200 on 20 kilograms of flour and 20 kilograms of rice for his family. These are exorbitant prices. There's really nowhere to go from there if that's what a family has to do to survive.
Thank you. I've got two more questions online. So the first from Mathilde Cousin.
Yes, thank you for taking my questions. Earlier this week, we learned about the death of a Palestinian doctor. He was called Dr. Hamed Al-Makroma. He was a plastic surgeon working for Hashifa Hospital. I was wondering if you got any information about the circumstances of his death.
Sorry, Mathilde, your question wasn't super clear. Can you try and repeat that?
Yes, earlier this week.
We got the question, but we don't have any information on that, Doctor.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Question from Felix Flor.
Hello? Hello?
Yep, go ahead.
Do you hear me? Okay, I'm Felix Flores from La Vanguardia in Barcelona. It's a question about weapons being used against civilians. You spoke about children being shot by quadcopter drones, people injured by explosive, but as you know, the IDF has a tradition of using modern weapons in Gaza. It happened about 15 years ago when they used white phosphorus. 10 years back, they used a special munition. My question is if you witness some kind of injuries caused by modern or unknown weapons so far.
At the beginning of the war, there were reports of some of the surgeons with whom we worked who would send photos that asking if this was white phosphorus, for example. The problem is that we weren't there to verify because we didn't have access to the hospitals where they were working at the time. Since then, I haven't heard any more reports of suspected white phosphorus, if that's what you're asking.
Not just white phosphorus, but modern weapons not seen before.
Okay, well, in that sense, yes.
Kind of injuries not seen before.
Right. What we're seeing, I mean, yeah, okay. I think it's, regardless of the weapons not seen before, it's also the context where it's being used. So if you're talking about, like, for example, 2,000-pound bombs that are not meant for urban warfare, yeah, that we're seeing. And I think that Chris touched on this as well. That type of military aid needs to seriously be questioned in this context, and those providing that military aid need to seriously be held accountable. I am speaking as an American here and not MSF. I am disgusted, in fact, by the fact that these weapons are continuing to be provided for use against a civilian population with wanton impunity.
I would maybe add, aside from the question of what weapons are being used, the severity of the trauma, the broken limbs, the catastrophic fractures, the burn wounds, the dressings that require people being put under general anesthetic just to change their bandages, to change their dressings is acute. The number of kids that I've seen over the last couple of weeks who are severely disfigured because of the blast wounds and then the fires that follow is extraordinary. So whatever the type of weapons that are being used, the consequences are utterly unacceptable. And this is happening in a context of utter impunity. And I would go further than that, in that it is a context of complicity. And this must end, because if this situation is also then translated to Rafah, as we have seen from the destruction that has happened further north, where whole areas, whole neighborhoods have been completely pulverized, and the intensity of the pressure of the healthcare in the middle area, it is unbelievable to try and imagine what that would look like and feel like for the 1.5 million people who are squeezed into that small area in the south of the Gaza Strip.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the room? Okay, we'll take one last question online from Cliff Shiko, I apologize.
Okay, thanks very much. Cliff Shiko from Jacaranda FM in Johannesburg. I'm sorry if the question has been answered, but how is MSF coping with medical supplies, considering the ongoing blockades at entry points? And also, if possible, can the chat box be opened for administrative questions, or maybe the names of the speaker be repeated at the end? Thank you.
So I mentioned this earlier, but it's okay. In terms of the medical supplies, what I was saying is that it's arbitrary what gets in and what doesn't get in from one day to the next. So we have had many tons of medical supplies sent in from the beginning of the war, but it's definitely not enough for all the medical issues that we're seeing across the Gaza Strip. And as I said, we're not alone in the Gaza Strip. We work within a healthcare system, and if we get it in, I don't know, say diazepam in today, we're not sure that another organization will get in the same medication tomorrow.
To that, so we have had 60, as of the weekend, this last weekend, we've had 60 trucks which had entered into Gaza. We've had 22 medical trucks rejected at one point or another. Sorry, no, two medical trucks were rejected last week. The first on Monday, the 25th. In this truck, it was turned back because of external fixators, which are surgical equipment used to treat trauma and fix fractures. It's very hard for us after this point to understand why a truck was turned around. So, for example, in this particular case, we got this from information from the truck driver. And then on Thursday, the 28th of March, one truck containing items which were formally approved by COGAP before shipping was then not allowed to enter. And there are a number of items that we don't send that we would like to send because of the experience of others, particularly related to reconstruction of hospitals, spades, that sort of spades and that sort of equipment. But I would also re-emphasize the point that it's very unpredictable what comes across the border, but it's then about what happens when you get into the Gaza Strip, moving supplies around, being able to distribute those safely, being able to treat patients safely and consistently at the point of care.
Yeah, absolutely. That goes for medical items. We've had concerns about, or we've had issues with biomedical equipment, for example. The problem is that when certain items are blocked, you don't actually know which ones are being blocked, and then you have to turn the truck around and start the whole process over again, which is quite problematic for all the organizations trying to get in their medical items to have to start the process again once it's already gotten the initial green light. And I would say that it's the same in terms of distributing food and other types of aid or logistics support. Chlorine tablets, for example, we can't do very much in terms of chlorinating water and ensuring that the population has access to safe drinking water because we aren't allowed to send in chlorine tablets. When we talk about food aid, the distribution, as Chris mentioned, becomes a huge problem when we find that the police officers, for example, who were helping with the distributions of aid are no longer able to do so because they are seemingly being targeted. This makes the distribution very difficult. So getting it inside Gaza is a whole other issue.
Thank you very much. I think we will leave it there. I want to first firstly, our three speakers, Dr. Amber Alayyan, Christopher Lockyear, and Marie-Aure Revial for joining us today, and thank you for sharing your experiences and your thoughts. I know that it's all very much appreciated. Thank you also to all of our journalists who have joined us here in the room in Geneva and also online. To those online also, thank you for your patience in bearing with us in the couple of technical glitches. I'm aware that for a little while you didn't see video of our speakers, but that has been rectified. So thank you very much for bearing with us. There is a recording of this session, so we can make that available. Yes, and any other questions post this session, please get in contact with us. Thank you very much all for your attendance and participation today. Thank you.